Well, friends, good evening. You can speak. It's all right. Thank you. You might. And welcome to it's our ongoing series on mental health, mental illness. So we've been off to a good start. Justin Perry was with us a couple of weeks ago. That was a great program. The YouTube hits on this have been something. It spreads around. A lot of other people have seen it. You're able, if you're at a program like this, to show it to someone else. So that's a great thing. We've had some other small group things that we've done, and we have a couple things that are coming up. So I've asked Bill Roth, who's our Minister of Congregational Care and who's really the leader engineer of this entire series, to talk to you briefly about that.
Good evening again. Yes, next week we're going to have 3 more presentations, so it would be helpful for us to make this hospitable to you, to have the right room sizes and such, if you would go to our website and sign up. The programs are going to be, there's one on meditation that's going to be offered. There's going to be one on suicide prevention, and then there's one on spiritual direction. And you choose from one of those 3 programs. So if you would, go to the website, choose a program, sign up. We'll have the room all set up. If for some chance you don't get signed up, come out anyway.
And our website is myersparkumc.org. There's all kinds of interesting stuff there, but especially on this series. So thanks to Bill and the others on the committee and all who've put this together. It's been one of the things that's been wonderful about this, I would say, has been more kind of anecdotal stuff than informal stuff. I periodically have people who will email me or call me or come by and tell me their story, some of the pain that they have. Since we started this series, that has quintupled. I don't know what the right number would be. Just naming it has caused people to say, you know, I've got a story too. I've got a struggle. I have parents that have been abusive forever. I have all kinds of things. Part of our goal is to create a safe place here to talk about those things. We're delighted and honored. So tonight we have with us Dr. Warren Kinghorn. That's Warren sitting next to me here. You noticed that. And Warren was with us 2 or 3 years ago. I can't remember. He gave a lecture. And it was an outstanding thing. That was in our Emotionally Healthy Spirituality series that we were doing, and he's consented to come back. Warren has, there are a lot of fabulous resume things that we could do about Warren. He has 12 doctorates or something like that. Yeah. And he is jointly appointed to 2 faculties, which is part of why he's here. He's on the medical school faculty at the school that yesterday I promised I wouldn't mention, and I won't mention it again. But it's a school where I went to school myself once upon a time.
It had a great second half the other night.
There you are.
Yeah.
People kept saying to me, that was a great game. I got, no, it was a great half.
That's right.
That's all we got out of that game.
Yeah.
But he's also appointed to the Divinity School, a program that began, how many years ago did the medicine and divinity?
About 4 years ago, theology, medicine, and culture.
Theology and medicine, fascinating intersections that when I was in seminary, this didn't even come up. We didn't talk much about the intersection between theology and medicine, although it's a big part of what clergy wind up doing in their lives, who spend a lot of time in hospitals and with people in various situations. So anyway, Warren, anyway, there are a lot of things that we could say about Warren, but the most important thing for us here at our church is that he is Mark Kinghorn's brother. And if you know Mark is an absolutely stellar human being and church leader. He was our administrative board chair, the immediate past one. And he's just incredible. He's a great theologian himself and he's got a real pastor's heart. Mark's amazing.
And he's out of town tonight, so he's like, have fun at my church.
He honored his brother coming by flying to Tampa for a work gig he couldn't get out of. So Warren, you're here. I first want to ask you just a couple things about yourself. How did you get into this thing, this kind of intersection of medicine and divinity?
Yeah, religion? Great question. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to come back. I'm like, it's always an honor when I'm someplace and then I get invited back. So that's like, it's like, doesn't always happen. So I'm grateful to be here in this really beautiful space and to be here in this congregation. One of the things I'd also say about our work in theology, medicine, and culture at Duke is that we have a program called the Reimagining Health Collaborative that's a collaborative of congregations who partner with us and with each other to think about health and medicine and health care. And Myers Park was one of our first cohort of congregations. And some of you in the audience were part of that work. So I'm just grateful for you all for that. So thank you for being here to caring about these topics that we're talking about tonight. I am a psychiatrist and also trained in theology. And as James said, work on both sides of that. For me, these questions, I sometimes wish in talking about these things that I had a really strong kind of personal story that got me initially interested in these questions. That wasn't the case initially for me. It subsequently has been. But I found that as a student, as a first-year medical student, I went to Harvard Medical School, and I found myself getting into medical school. So I know many of you in the audience in a room like this are healthcare clinicians, and really wanting to understand what I was learning and what I was seeing in the hospital from my perspective as a Christian. What did it mean to think and act as a Christian in medicine? And that really came to a head for me in a couple of days that I spent shadowing at a detox facility in Boston, in Mattapan, and talking to these men. It was all men there who were addicted to alcohol, were there to get clean, would talk about how they wished that they wouldn't drink, they didn't want to drink, but then they did drink and they hated themselves for drinking and they were trying to get clean and they had hope. And I left thinking, like, what was going on there? Like, how does that relate to, say, the Christian understanding of sin? Like, is sin related to alcohol use? And I began to realize that I'd been in church all my life, but I didn't really have a way to make sense of that question. It's still a really complicated question to me. And but then I realized that there were Christians as early as like the 4th and 5th centuries, like 1600 years ago, who were having debates about this. And one of the debates was that St. Augustine, some of you know, and really argued with followers of this British monk named Pelagius. Basically, the argument was basically a question of, Pelagius said, all humans are basically born with the ability not to sin, and we make free choices. And so it's possible that we can go through our lives without sinning, and therefore, when we do sin, it's on us. And that kind of made sense to me. I'd sort of been formed like that. And then St. Augustine, who was this North African bishop and theologian, said, actually, it's not that way, that humans don't have the capacity to make free choices for the good over the course of our lives. We all are sort of bound in some ways to act in ways that are not our good. And that's Augustine's idea of original sin, that we don't have the capacity not to sin. And for Augustine, that was great because it meant that we all need grace. Like, you can't say that any of us, have the capacity to be perfect in and of ourselves, because we all stand in need of grace. So I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't learn that in medical school. Those are really complicated ways of thinking. So then I wanted to think more about, how did Christians understand health and medicine and health care? And then I got really interested in these questions about mental health and what do we mean when we talk about mental health? And then I think God allowed me to just have experiences both as a clinician and also just as a person in having lots of conversations, engagements with people, with friends and loved ones with mental illness, experiencing anxiety myself, having to think about these things and having to experience them as a Christian. And so ultimately I became a psychiatrist. And now I have the privilege of kind of walking with pastors and students and psychiatry residents and others to kind of think about these questions, not to mention my own patients at the Durham VA.
When you talk that way, it reminds me of Nancy Reagan, as First Lady, decided to have a war on drugs, and her sort of mantra was just say no, just say no. And what I've always said is, if you can just say no, it's not something you struggle with, right? Mm-hmm. But if something's hard, you're unable to just say no. And then sometimes in church, they'll say, oh, if you just believe in God, everything will be fine. Or I was talking to somebody pretty recently, battling very serious depression, and this is somebody in another church, and a friend that he went to church with said, if you just have a positive attitude, So helpful. Oh, God, I didn't think of that. Right, it'd be great. Let's talk about that. How's the church done with mental health over time? I mean, how have we done well? But what are our failures? Has the church historically done damage to people, do you think?
Yeah, what do you all think about that? I think yes to both, actually. So there's people who think that the church is just the answer to everything, and then there's also people who think that the church is the answer to nothing and the cause of problems. I think in respect to mental health, it's a both and thing, and we have to just name that and acknowledge that. I think on one hand, it's important. So we're sitting here in a church. The church has actually been really important over the course of history, not only in caring for people with mental illness, but even like imagining new ways that we can do that. So just historically, the first psychiatric hospital in the Western world was founded in Valencia, Spain, in the early 1400s, and it was a Christian mission. There's a really interesting story about a priest named Juan Gilberto Joffre who saw a man being beaten on the streets of Valencia. He told the people beating this man to stop. He took the man to the chapter house where he was staying, and he stood up in the cathedral that Sunday and said, it's the first Sunday in Lent, and said, we can't let this happen. We need a hospital. And there was one formed, and Christians initiated the psychiatric hospital. The Quakers in England really dreamed up a new way of caring for people with mental illness by moving people out of urban institutions that were like jails and into these country retreats where there was communion with nature and with others. There's lots of other examples like that. So Christians actually have been really important in pioneering really great practices. And churches now do a lot of really, really important work in providing support and care and encouragement and places of belonging. And we can talk more about that. There's no question, though, that the church often is not a friendly place for people with mental illness. And when I say mental illness, that covers a lot of different things that are different depending on what we're talking about. But people can experience the church in lots of negative ways, as a place of shame, as a place of judgment, as a place of exclusion. There's a couple of things that I think churches fall into really easily, and I think maybe to name it, maybe especially kind of white churches fall into fairly easily. One would be, these are two kind of false gospels, I think. One would be the false gospel of effortless perfection. The term effortless perfection was originated, I think, at Duke maybe 15 years ago or so, when an undergraduate woman at Duke wrote an article in the Duke student newspaper, and she said, effortless perfection characterizes what life as a woman undergraduate at Duke is like, and that you're supposed to be basically always looking great, making good grades, going out on the weekends, just seeming like having it all together, and you're not supposed to look like you're even trying to do it. It's just natural. And her point was that takes an incredible amount of effort to do that, to live up to the standard of effortless perfection. And it has an incredible cost. And churches can be places where effortless perfection is kind of assumed.
And I'd interject. I bet that's worse in an affluent white church. I would imagine. I once served a couple of poorer white churches where people could bleed all over the floor, and there wasn't shame in that. But in a culture like ours, right, that's kind of the standard. And we as a church, we're trying to figure out how to be sure that we break through that, and it's different. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I feel that in my own Presbyterian congregation in Durham, that absolutely is something. I think another thing, as James mentioned, is this kind of false gospel of positive thinking. We have this all through our culture, that if you just get your thoughts together in the right way, you're going to be happy, you're going to be successful, you're going to be rich, you're going to have good relationships. And so that carries over into church. So people just think, well, if you're depressed or you're anxious or you have obsessive compulsive disorder, just get your thoughts right, and then everything else will kind of fall into place, and you'll be all right. And the problem is this is not very biblical. The story of Israel. Think about the story of Israel is that sometimes you can think all the right things, you can even do the right things, and things don't work out well for you. We just don't live in that kind of a world where right thinking immediately leads to happiness and success. And if you have any doubt about that, just read the Psalms, which are full of people who are thinking rightly but not doing well, and calling out to God and saying why am I thinking all the right things and doing all the right things, but I'm not being blessed right now? And that's now captured for us in the Psalms, where we can read that and pay attention to that. One kind of way that positive thinking kind of gets a little bit mutated in ways that it's sometimes hard to recognize is that sometimes we have this kind of mind-body dualism in our culture, where we think that either mental illness exists kind of in the mind, in which case if you just think right, you'll be all right, and that's negative. But if you flip to the other extreme of that, and you think that mental illness is only in the body, as if a mental disorder is only a brain disorder and nothing else, then it actually kind of is part of the same thing, because the implication is if mental illness is in the body, then that's a way to explain why somebody can think rightly and things not be right. Because if we just thought right, things would be okay. So there must be a biological problem involved. And so it must be something that just needs to be treated with medication. And so in some ways, the gospel of positive thinking can show up in either focuses that just say all you have to do is think right and you'll be all right, or that say it's all in your body, it's not at all have to do with your relationships and your culture, it's just in your body. And so we have to get rid of that kind of dichotomy and recognize that we are embodied beings that live and breathe as bodies, and yet we can think and act in the right ways, and things don't always work out for us easily.
I think that's just really interesting. Because there is still, so we're church people, and the life of faith, spirituality matters to us, and there is still that, so it's not just thinking right or getting the right medication. Once in a while I find myself, so another thing that church carries is that if you just believe in God, if you just pray, then things will be better. And sometimes I feel like the Bible can be a problem in that if you read, say, the Gospel of Mark, the implication is Jesus walks into town and there's someone with, we could say, a mental illness. And almost without even praying and asking, Jesus just heals the person, and then boom, they're better. So this underwrites the idea that Jesus is the healer, God is a healer. So then I have people say to me, I've battled depression for 17 years. Why hasn't God healed? What do you make of that? Kind of the gospel stories and God's role in healing? People say God caused this thing. This is a really easy question.
Thanks a lot. This is a really complicated question. Yeah.
What do you do with all that?
Yeah. So how do we think about the healing stories in the Gospels? Well, one, I think you mentioned the Gospel of Mark. I used to, so no offense to my brother whose name is Mark, but I used to really dislike the Gospel of Mark, because I would encourage you to do this. Tonight, if you're, don't do this right before bed, or just try to read through the Gospel of Mark from beginning to end. It's not that long. It's incredibly there's something about it that when I first did that, it was really disturbing. It actually shook me a little bit, because the Gospel of Mark is not smooth prose. It's choppy. It leaves things unsaid. It's gruff. It doesn't it raises all these questions. And I used to not like Mark. I used to prefer Matthew or Luke, because they are a little bit more sort of smooth and, fill in the gaps a little bit. Now that I'm older, and also in the context of thinking about mental illness, I love the Gospel of Mark, because it's this raw view of what life with Jesus and the disciples was like. It doesn't end. Actually, the Gospel of Mark doesn't end in an easy way. The original version of Mark, and you can look in your Bibles at Mark 16, and all Bibles will note where what's called the shorter ending of Mark ends, which is the first version of the Gospel of Mark. The way the Gospel of Mark ends is women who ran from the tomb because they were terrified. The end. That's where it ends. Jesus has just been raised, and the women run from the tomb because they're terrified. And that's the gospel. That's where it ends. Now, earlier in the Gospel of Mark, one of the interesting things is that you see Jesus early in his ministry in Mark 3, preaching in his hometown and saying some things that were pretty challenging. And if you look in Mark 3:21, it says, "And his family went out to restrain him because they said he is out of his mind." Now, I think that's really interesting. Like, his family went out to restrain him because they said that he's out of his mind. Now, it didn't, I'm not saying as a psychiatrist that Jesus, had a mental illness. But he knew what it was like to have his family, those who knew him the best and had loved him the longest, to be so worried about him and so disturbed by what he was saying that they went out to restrain him and called him crazy. So if there's any question about like how God feels about people who live with mental illness or people who are on the margins in general, like we serve a God in Jesus who was called crazy by his own family and who lived with that kind of stigma, not to mention the stigma that came later in his life and ministry. So all the gospel healing stories, it's not like this Jesus who had everything all put together and then went and like healed people, but this is a Jesus who had been called crazy. He knew what it meant to be on the outs and on the margins. So any of us who ever feel like that, we're in good company. With the healing stories, I think that, all of them are a little bit different. They're different in John than in the other Gospels. But one of the things is that this wasn't a 20th century world they lived in. They didn't have, Carolina's healthcare all around to set their vision of healing. When Jesus healed, it wasn't just like curing medical diseases. It was restoring people to relationships. It was restoring people to the capacity to live lives where they could have basic human needs. It was restoring people to community. It was restoring people to God. They didn't see illness at that time as only a medical condition. They saw illness as something that threatened one's capacity to live in the world and in relationship with God and with others. So when Jesus healed people, he was showing that Jesus had come to restore those relationships with others and with community and with God. And the healing of the body was was a sign of that. It was part of that, but it was a sign of that broader reality. Now, in the medical system now, we often forget that, because we're so focused on like how cells work and how, electrolytes function and how the organ systems work, that we think of healing as just restoring the body. But Jesus never had that vision. Restoring the body alone was completely insufficient. And I think that's where the church has a lot to say to the healthcare system.
This community aspect is, it's really intriguing to me. Warren and I talked on the phone a few days before I left for Kenya. And what stuck with me in our conversation as much as anything is the way, think how this happens. So I've battled some things in my own soul and head, and when you're doing this, you feel like I am alone. Something is wrong with me, and no one else has this, no one else would it's a very isolating kind of thing, right? You kind of feel like alone. And then you ask questions like, how did I get here? How do I get out of here? I've had parents come to me before and say, whatever it is that parents of teenagers worry about, my child is drinking too much, or my child experimented with drugs. And one of the things that I always try to say to them is that feels to you like you as an individual parent have an issue with your individual child, but there's this culture that your child is being swept up in. If your child drinks, they're growing up in a drinking culture. Same thing applies to things, right? Like anxiety. Like if you have anxiety, you feel like it's your anxiety, but the whole culture, right? The whole culture is anxious, and it kind of feeds everyone. Talk about that. That was You're talking about what's the relationship of culture to mental illness in general? Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question that to think about the relationship when we think about mental illness. And here we kind of have to break it down in different ways. But is mental illness something that happens within an individual and then shows up in the context of relationship and culture and family and society? That's one way of thinking about it. And that's the way that, as a psychiatrist, I'm generally trained to think, because I treat individuals. Or is mental illness something that happens in cultures and relationships and families and societies, and then shows up in the life of an individual?
And I find as a psychiatrist, it's often really, really helpful for me to think about both of those questions when I'm sitting with someone. Like, is say, this particular person who is depressed, as we're talking and trying to figure out what's going on, is this an individual problem that's showing up in a broader social relational context, or is this a social relational problem that's showing up in an individual context? How do we think through that? There's a good book, as I was thinking about this question, I just ran across this book that some of you may have already read, and I've not finished it, so I'm like, foolishly recommending a book I've not finished. But it just showed up in the last few weeks by a journalist named Johann Hari, named Lost Connections. Are you familiar with this book? Have you read it? Hari's a journalist, and he's written this book on basically what are the he calls them the real causes of depression. I think that there's a different story that he overemphasizes some things. But he talks about depression in our culture, which we have this kind of epidemic of depression, that depression has grown in prevalence over the last 20, 30 years. Part of that is because we're defining it more broadly, and that's one of the reasons. But also it's probably because increasingly people are feeling the characteristic symptoms of depression and associating with that. And so Hari's asking, what's going on? And he says it's not just that people have differently functioning neurotransmitter systems or brain function than was the case 40 or 50 years ago. I mean, there is absolutely that component of depression, but it's that the culture that we live in doesn't serve our basic psychological needs. And he has different chapters in this book. He talks about depression is related to disconnection from meaningful work, disconnection from other people, disconnection from meaningful values, disconnection from childhood trauma, disconnection from status and respect, disconnection from the natural world, disconnection from a hopeful or secure future. Because when people feel disconnected from those things, especially from all of those things, as some of the veterans who I take care of in the VA system do, then depression is kind of a natural human response to that feeling of disconnection. And in converse, in this particular case, depression, the treatment of depression involves, among other things, perhaps like medication and other bodily therapies and psychotherapy, involves reconnection to other people, to meaningful values, to engaging childhood trauma, status and respect, the natural world, hopeful or secure future. So there are forms of depression, I think, that are pretty much completely biological, that sort of come on people for biological reasons that seem to have very little to do with what's happening in relationships and culture and other things. I see that as a psychiatrist. Most clinicians see that. I think that absolutely happens. It may well have happened or be happening to some of you in this room. But that's a fairly small subset of the total number of people who are depressed in Charlotte at this point. A lot more broadly is people who are feeling really disconnected, and that's showing up as depression. So when we think about the church's response, the church has the capacity to not just to be a place of support for people who are depressed, but also to work on some of those kind of basic causes. How do we reconnect each other in relationship and to purpose and to the natural world and to worship? All these things that disconnection, we feel that as loneliness.
Yeah, in my notes, I'd written down this question, which is, we shouldn't just ask, how do individuals get better, but how does the church get better? Interesting question. What would your dream for the church be in the face of what people sense and feel and what we observe in our society? What's God calling the church to?
Yeah. And this is where I really am looking forward to hearing your comments as we open up this conversation later. If we think of the church as the body of Christ in the world that is reflecting God's glory in the world and gathering the world in praise and honor to God in the new creation, then it's important that we keep that in mind. I'd say I'd want the church to be a place where people feel loved and known, and deeply known, not just known and loved by each other, but known and loved by God. We'll remind ourselves that before all else, we are people who are known and who are loved by God. And we can hold each other in that and to that. I think also the church is a place where we call each other into vocation in different ways. So the church isn't just a place where we show up and like feel nice for a Sunday morning, but the church is an organism. It's a body. It does things. And the different members of the church are called to do things, to have functions like the body does, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. And so the question for any of us in the church is like, what are we called to? What's our vocation? And if somebody's not sure what that is, if they feel kind of like they're like an appendage that isn't like can't figure out quite what its role is, then the church needs to be a place where we call each other into vocation in that way.
What are there? I think I ought to ask this: are there things the church can do that the mental health system lacks? Are there special, or do we have some peculiar niche in this market, something that we can offer to people that people really need that you can't really get it from the psychiatrist or whatever?
Yeah. I think there's, let me answer that by way of saying things that I think that we can say to each other, because you were asking kind of how the church can be helpful. Some things to say and some things not to say, and then that might help to kind of account for what the church maybe specifically can do. So is that right? So one of the things that I think is helpful to say, a few things that the church can do. I think one is to name mental illness by its name, and to make church a place where people can name that. So this series is, I think, a part of that. You all have done some good work here in trying hard to find ways to name mental illness. So it's not a good thing in church generally if we have a kind of areas of human experience that a lot of people are feeling that can't be talked about in church. That's not a good sign. And in the case of mental illness, if you look at the national surveys on this, 45% of us or so over the course of our lives will meet the psychiatrist criteria for some form of mental illness. If you look at just depression, like 16% of us over the course of our lives will be depressed, and about 5% of us at any given time are somewhere in that zone of depression. So if you think about all the hundreds of people, or maybe thousands of people that come to Myers Park on a Sunday morning, if you think like 1 in 20 is depressed actively, or maybe not coming because they're depressed, but usually is there, that's a lot of people. And there's a lot of people who love those people and who are around. And so to be able to talk openly about depression and anxiety and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and substance abuse, and to be able to name that and talk about it like we would name and talk about other health issues is really important. And that's not the kind of thing that can happen only through an event like this. It takes practice. Like, it takes practice in small groups and in Sunday school classes and in worship services to just continue to name it. Because the more you name it, the easier it is for people for whom that's like a central part of experience to just be able to talk about it. And the trick is how to name it without letting those labels that are psychiatrist labels engulf someone's identity. So simply because I live with depression doesn't mean that that's the only relevant thing about me. Or the fact that I live with bipolar disorder doesn't mean that that's the only relevant thing about me. I'm also, a person who has goals and needs and vocations and everything else. So how do we name it without letting the diagnosis sort of take over our identity? And I think we can also focus on like the hard parts of Scripture. So don't just read Psalm 23, read Psalm 88, which is this incredibly like dark psalm that doesn't end well. And yet, when somebody's, look it up. Don't read this right before bed. When somebody's like in the middle of a depressive episode, Psalm 88, which ends with all of my companions are in darkness, can be really deeply healing and deeply, deeply helpful. And other things. I think a few things to say. One would be like, we know that this is hard, and just to be able to name that, so that people can be experiencing hard things, and that's okay. It kind of opens space for people just to name our experience.
And not pity. There's a subtle distinction. There's a huge difference, right, between kind of mercy and compassion and pity. I pity her. Well, no, not many people I know actually want to be pitied. You want to be respected. You want to be befriended. Pitied is this kind of thing. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that's right. 'Cause, I was in conversation with a minister who is in the Christian Reformed Church, and I was up in Michigan, and she was, she's very public about her story, so I'll credit her by name. Her name is Cindy Holtrip, and she lived for 13 years with a pretty severe, serious depression, or recurrent depression, that really cost her dearly in terms of her professional life and her church life, and she tells the story now, having been sort of in recovery from depression for several years. And she talks about she actually at one point left the church that she knew best and went to worship at another church across town. And she said that people at that church loved her, but every week people would come up to her and say, Cindy, how are you? And she said, that's not what I needed. I didn't want that kind of exposure, which would be like to be having to sort of give account for how I was at any given moment. She said it was much more helpful when somebody would just come up and say, hey, I know things are hard. We're praying for you. And without like the expectation of like having to sort of constantly be telling her story, when year after year after year, things seem not to be getting better. And so I just share that, something that she taught me as a way not to respond in pity or in this sense of like that in every given moment you're going to ask somebody to have this deeply intimate conversation about the things that they're most troubled. I think people ought to be able to be in church and to just have the space opened for things not to be going well without having to like be then the subject of constant sort of I think pity isn't a very good feeling when you're constantly there.
Yeah, and this weird kind of thing that we can own within Christianity in terms of, how to put it, that brokenness, in America we would say brokenness is bad, fixedness is good, but there can be a giftedness in brokenness. I was reading some of this, one night I was watching, Stephen Colbert, the source of all, holy knowledge in the world. And he was interviewing a guy who had written a book called First Rate Madness. And what he does in this book is he talks about great leaders who have suffered terrible depression. And it's not that they overcame their depression and became great leaders. His argument is they were great leaders because of their depression, that they could understand the complexity of issues, that they had sympathy for people that were hurting, and so on. In terms of pastors, a lot of pastors would actually be very effective because they've battled some darkness in their own soul. They're not likely to shame people. They're not likely to say, there's a quick fix. But if we at the church are interviewing for a new pastor, if the first thing the person says is, I'm bipolar, everybody would sort of panic. But yet there could be kind of a giftedness in that, right? I mean, Paul talks about God's strength is perfected in our weakness.
Yeah, I have a friend who lives with really active bipolar disorder, who is a pastor, and I have to say, like, she has taught me an incredible amount, both about grace and also about Scripture, honestly, like what it means to read the Bible, and what it means to be bold, and so I just am really indebted to her for that in many ways.
Something you touched on earlier maybe got my mind going. So I wonder if let's say we as a congregation, you were talking about being known and being known deeply. If we could decide kind of among ourselves that we would try to work a different kind of discipline in terms of how we think about each other, right? So I could think of any given person. I could, John Clarkson. I could say, John Clarkson. He was the head of the medical school at the University of Miami, and he played football at Princeton. And everybody around here would go, hey, man, John's amazing, right? So I could think that way about John, but maybe I think about John differently. Maybe I think about John as, he's a child of God. He's somebody who is seeking God. He's somebody who has struggles at times. If you know what I'm saying, that we just decide our default way of thinking in this church is not going to be the way everybody else in the world always sizes people up. And you come here and you don't, people call me Dr. Howell. I so don't need that. I appreciate whatever that is. I'm really happy to be James. Like, he's just a guy. I'm not scolding anybody. But where those kinds of honorifics, that's not a big thing among us. That the honorific that we offer to one another is to say, you're God's child. This is a safe place for you. You're a recipient of God. I mean, how better could you honor anyone in the first place, right, than to offer them that kind of compassion and grace. Anyhow, what else from the church? What are some things churches do that you know about that are cool?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing to say about churches in relationship, I have as a psychiatrist working in a big medical system, I have kind of envy of the church in some ways, because when I see patients, it's, even if I'm following people fairly closely, I'm seeing them usually just themselves, maybe with a family member present. It's almost always in the office that I'm using in the hospital, and it's highly structured by like the expectation of a medical encounter. So I'm looking at the electronic medical record, I'm going over medications, I'm doing medication reconciliation, I'm having to focus on symptoms because that's what I'm expected to do by different system quality metrics, that kind of thing. So it's very hard to get out of my office and not feel like you've been in a very medical space, because it is a medical space. Like maybe it ought to feel like that. But there's so much that I'm not seeing in the lives of the patients whom I follow at the VA. I might know generally where they live. Like I might know that they live in Warrenton, North Carolina, but I don't know what it feels like there. I don't know like how far it is to the grocery store unless I ask the patient. I don't know what their church is like, and whether it's a church that's like a generally supportive place or whether it's a church that's just incredibly toxic and everybody's backbiting and it's not a good supportive place. I don't know what their family's like. I don't know what their people are. I don't know. There's so much that I don't know about, and that's just is the nature, I think, of a lot of medical care. So if you look to the medical system to sort of be the answer for caring for people with mental illness, unless somebody is really fortunate to have a really close relationship with a therapist that they see weekly and really can develop a really close relationship, you're not going to get that kind of context and knowledge. But churches, you all see each other every week, and pastors know their congregations really well, much better than most psychiatrists know their patients that have a lot of patients. And like you eat together, and you pray together, and you worship together, and you sing together. None of those are things that I can do in a clinical space. There's ways of knowing each other in that way, by eating together, and by sharing life together, and getting to know each other's kids, and getting to know each other's families, and praying for each other, and being in each other's homes. There's no way that any medical system is ever going to approximate that. So if you think about how can the church be helpful? It's just by being the church, like doing the kinds of things that church has done for 2,000 years in providing fellowship, accountability, challenge, support, but for the most part, a place of being known and loved, and of being called into service and discipleship. So we need to be able to say to each other, we love you, we need you, you belong here, and we miss you when you're not here, because we need you for our common mission. And so if people can really feel like when they're not there, they're being missed, and that's where a sense of belonging comes from. And belonging will go an awful long way for a lot of common forms of mental illness, a long way, and maybe further than a lot of what I can do as a psychiatrist can.
I heard a pastor go on a riff the other day about belonging to a church. And I said, what church do you belong to? And he kind of turned it and said, I belong to that church. What that means is like, I belong there, right? I'm part of that. That's where I need to be. I belong there. I love that. Warren, so much of this has been really illuminating and inspiring. Warren wants to field questions from you. And as I always do at this point, I want to remind you, we don't have a mic to go around, so if you go on for a long time, no one will hear you, and we're not smart enough to remember all that you might say.
So any hard questions, I'll turn them to James.
Yeah. So if you have a question, and shorter the better, just ask a question, then Warren can pick up on this. So are there questions, things you wonder about, that you'd like to hear about?
What do you feel about the phrase mental illness as opposed to a mental condition? Or do you think mental illness stigmatizes?
Yeah.
Linda was asking, do you think mental illness is itself when Justice Perry was here, we talked a lot about stigma and how that comes to be.
Yeah.
So is that very title, does that create a stigma?
Yeah, it's a great question. Does the term mental illness stigmatize? If you look over the course of history and the way that we name what we now might name mental illness or mental disorders, or I often use the word mental health problems, but if you look at the way that the language has evolved, you have what I call stigma creep, where like terms that we would never use now, the word crazy is a little bit different. It's sort of always been stigmatizing. But terms like insanity, lunacy, idiocy, words that like no one should ever, unless they're sort of trying to be historical or pejorative, should be an issue. Those started as like neutral medical clinical terms. Insanity just means like lack of mental health. Literally, in its etymology, it just means the lack of being sane. Insane means healthy, so it means unhealthy. But we now think of insane as being, and so what we see is that the stigma follows the language. So every time people in the medical system come up with a different way of naming this set of experience and behavior, eventually the term gets sort of stigmatized, and then you have to move on to a new way of speaking. So I see that both ways. And on the other hand, like some people in advocacy communities, like in NAMI, for example, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, like embrace that term mental illness because they say, well, the way to confront stigma is just to embrace the term and to not run from it and to go with it. So I always want to follow where people, as a psychiatrist, I always want to not ascribe labels, but follow where people go. If somebody is finding the term mental illness stigmatizing, then I won't use it in the context of that relationship. When I'm speaking in contexts like this, I think there's enough use of the term mental illness in advocacy communities and among people who live with mental illness that I think it's still something that can be named and is part of the community. But I'm trying to follow the lead of others in that. I do sometimes use the word mental health problem. I think that sometimes is a more general term that isn't quite as medical. But mainly, I don't think there's any way out of it. I think the stigma follows the term. So the answer is not to find a different term, but it's to confront the stigma head on and to say, how can we be places where all of this experience, whatever its name, is not associated with stigma and shame. And if that's the case, then the power of the stigmatizing language is broken.
Yeah, and if we think about the word illness, that's a common word that we use all the time that's not stigmatized at all. If I say to you, I visited my mother today, she's having an illness, you wouldn't think, you would think, well, yeah, what is it? Arthritis? Does she have a cold? Does she have the flu? Illness is a common kind of thing. So, Ray.
Yeah, you said you wear a hat with the Divinity School?
I do.
And a hat with the medical system.
Yes.
In the context of the Divinity School, you haven't said anything about students, Divinity students. And I don't know if you work with them at all. And because if you do, my question would be, what kinds of things are you seeing with that subgroup of students these days?
Yeah,
Ray's asking about what he observes among Divinity students who
Yeah.
could be your pastor one day.
Yeah, great question.
What's he observing among them? That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I don't do clinical work with college university students. I'm a teacher in a university. But when I speak to colleagues who do, I think what campuses across the country are reporting, and this is especially the case with more elite institutions like Duke, but I think it's also broadly the case in other places too. There's a lot more demand for campus mental health services than there ever has been before. And a lot more people coming in with, especially with depression and anxiety on college campuses than ever before, in terms of service utilization. Why that's the case is a little unclear. Part of it is possibly due to decreased stigma of help seeking as the social media culture, but also the culture as a whole, has encouraged people to seek help. And campuses have done a lot to invest in mental health services. People wonder if disconnection from in a kind of generation that's connecting to each other in different ways, maybe contributing to that. I don't really know. I would say I thought kind of naively when I took, I was a resident in psychiatry at Duke, and then I became a medical faculty member, and I was a graduate student in the Divinity School, along with Melanie Dobson. So we were students together. And when I came on the Divinity faculty in 2010, I had this idea that I was going to be a teacher, and that my work as a psychiatrist was going to be mostly at the hospital, and I was going to be meeting with students, as a teacher and talking about academic things and having academic conversations. And I really quickly learned that the most meaningful conversations that I had with students were ones where there was discussion of really deep pain and loss and struggle, and that there's nothing that happens in the world as a whole that isn't happening among pastors and that isn't happening among Divinity students. Whether it's childhood trauma, whether it's depression, anxiety, whether it's mood disorders, whether it's just really, really complicated situations. And so I see that. So I think the church isn't a protected place from whatever happens in the rest of life, and the clergy are definitely not protected. Matter of fact, if you look at the Clergy Health Initiative study at Duke that looked at depression among United Methodist clergy in North Carolina, the United Methodist clergy in North Carolina were more likely to be depressed by about 50% than the population as a whole at any given time. For the most part, they loved their work, and there was a lot of really great things that were happening, but they were more likely to be depressed.
Having had a family member that really struggled with depression and anxiety, one of the things that we found out was plugging into the system and figuring out how to get meaningful assistance and help was just baffling.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about any efforts that are being made to maybe make the system a little more accessible to parents, family members who are trying to get a loved one to the right person? And I guess my context is, I had a family member that probably has been to 6 different psychologists and psychiatrists, and nothing's fit.
Yeah, Rick's asking about the challenge of just getting connected to the system. Sometimes people come to me, to any of us on the staff, and ask this question. It's a huge challenge. It's like, how do I find my way into appropriate help?
It's a great question, and I don't live in Charlotte, so I can't speak to this city, and each city has its own network of clinicians and relationships. I really struggle with this in our area. So we have 2 major medical schools, hundreds of physicians, a lot of whom are doing research in Durham and Orange County, 2 psychiatry residency programs, and lots of people who finish their psychology and psychology. So we're among the most well-resourced clinical places in the United States. And I struggle when somebody comes to me, because I work only in the VA system, when somebody comes to me and says, who in the community could see my child? I sometimes struggle to know who to refer to. And if I struggle with that, being a psychiatrist connected in some way to the clinical community and struggle with a referral, it just speaks to, I think, the real challenge. And the challenges are both in terms of insurance, who takes insurance and who doesn't, and some people just are excluded from lots of different systems in that way, to the question of, like, even if you have an insurance panel and you can then maybe select from a panel who would be a good fit depending on the situation. And there, I don't have anything to offer except that I think that the therapeutic alliance between a client or patient and therapist or clinician is really important. And it's never a bad thing if you're wondering whether a particular therapist would be a good fit, just to call them up. If they're taking new patients, almost all therapists are willing to have an initial phone conversation, basically about the question of what their methods are, what their approach is, and whether there's a fit. To go in for an initial visit to see how that goes, and there's never any harm in after that saying, I don't think this is the right fit, I'm going to find someone else. It may take 1 or 2 or 3 visits to find the right person, but that would be the way to go about it. I realize that that itself is costly and of time and money, but sometimes it takes some kind of trial and error is not quite the right word, but some just starting the search, seeing if something works, and then if it doesn't, quickly moving on to someone else. And that's presuming there's the possibility of connection. If people are shut out of resources, that is a different problem that really has to do with, like, what's offered in this area for people that may not have insurance, for example.
This came up when Justin Perry was here, the access question. Then also what he just touched on is there's the other access question, right? Which is a lot of us in this room are people who are connected and we have resources and so on. Huge segments of our society, we don't allocate societal resources in egalitarian ways. And that's another way. What's the church's role in mental health? It's not just loving people. Maybe at some point it's we're part of the public will. Like we forget this. There's a public will on any number of issues, whether it's housing or education or anything else. We're a big chunk of that public will. So what if we changed our part of that public will around the allocation of resources around mental health? That would be a great thing. John.
How do you incorporate your faith when you are counseling veterans?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do I incorporate my faith when I'm counseling veterans? Yeah, great question, because I'm a federal employee, so I work in a VA hospital, and I work for the government in that way. So I'm not one of these psychiatrists who like has I don't advertise myself as a Christian psychiatrist. I don't do a specifically faith-based model of therapy or care. I do find that of the veterans whom I take care of, a lot have really active faith lives of their own. They're usually, they don't often go to church, but they usually pray and read Scripture, and they kind of want to go to church. Like, at least they would go to church if they could find a church that they felt they were connected to. And so I'll ask very openly, like, about, are you a religious or spiritual person? And then if they say yes, I'll ask about that. And I'll ask about, if they're Christian, as most of my patients are, like, what's that like? If you pray, how do you pray, and what do you pray for? And if you read Scripture, what Scriptures do you read, and what's helpful? And we might talk about that. And that can go an awful long way. And we talk about church, and we talk about a church can be wounding, and also how it can be healing. And I think that's important. The way I think that I think as a clinician about really all of medicine, and especially of mental health, is that my role is not to just meet a consumer demand. It's not to satisfy quality metrics. It's not even to treat symptoms, although that's really important, but that my role is to come alongside those who are on a journey as someone who myself is on a journey, and to walk together and always to ask, like, what's needed right now for the journey? So in any given point of this person's life, what's needed right now? Now, that doesn't have to look explicitly faith-based or Christian. Like, a patient might feel my presence in that way and not feel like that's a specifically Christian approach, because I don't think it is specifically Christian. I think you can frame that in different ways. But for me, that's what it means to be a Christian in healthcare, is to walk alongside those who are on a journey and to ask what's needed right now for the journey, and to provide some help and comfort and support and encouragement along the way. And that also opens up the question of what's needed. So it might be that medication is needed. It might be, as it was the case a few hours ago, that, getting rid of a loaded gun is what's needed. It might be that a meal is what's needed. It might mean that a job is what's needed. It might mean that a different kind of relationship, or maybe getting out of a certain kind of relationship, is what's needed. So those are all questions that come. So the question of what's needed right now for the journey is really important to me. So, and I think that's how Christians ought to be thinking about healthcare as a whole. Like, what does it mean to walk alongside fellow travelers?
Very often people come to me and they're looking for a referral to a counselor. Sometimes it's for individual counseling. Sometimes it's for marital counseling. Like, our marriage is falling apart, and they'll say, can you refer me to a Christian counselor? And I try to divine why they put the word Christian in front of it, if they are looking to ensure that the role that faith plays in their life will be part of it, or if they're thinking, and a lot of times, sometimes in that same conversation, they'll say, can you just give me some Bible verses that will help? And I don't want to demean that in the least, but there are no 7 Bible verses or 577 Bible verses that treat these things very well. What do you think's in that when people were seeking a Christian counselor? Is there a danger in it?
There's a long history of people perceiving that psychiatry and psychology are kind of non-Christian disciplines, or maybe even anti-Christian disciplines. So Freud was himself kind of basically called himself an atheist, but was Jewish, and tended to have fairly disparaging comments about organized religion, although it's kind of complicated with him. Even more, the behaviorists, who really were the kind of founders of modern research psychology, were in some cases very clearly atheistic in their orientation. And so those kind of dual histories of Freud and psychoanalysis and behavioral psychology often kind of led to this perception that Christians shouldn't have anything to do with those disciplines. That's really not the case now. I think actually psychiatry now, my own field, is actually quite open to, it may not be open to like robustly theological approaches, like, asking really deep questions about psychiatry, but it's very open to faith and to spirituality and to having patients bring their faith into clinical practice. And you find, for the most part, psychiatrists are very open to that, as are most psychologists. So the fact that somebody isn't like specifically a Christian psychologist or Christian psychiatrist doesn't mean that they won't be really appreciative and supportive of faith. I think there are movements of specifically Christian counseling or Christian psychology that are actually quite different from each other. There's one movement that came out of, in general, places like Fuller Theological Seminary and Biola University and Western Michigan that emphasize like taking kind of the best of clinical psychology and integrating it with Scripture in ways that people who are like graduates of Fuller Theological Seminary, for the most part, are credentialed, licensed clinical psychologists. They are accountable to all of the professional standards that any other psychologists are accountable to, and they have theological training, so they're kind of equipped, especially for people from a more evangelical context, to kind of think about those questions. And I know some really outstanding clinicians that are in that category. There's a different trajectory called biblical counseling that some of you may have encountered or not, that is from a very different strain of thought that really was very critical of psychology and psychotherapy, and that emphasized that the counseling should be the role of the pastor, that the Bible should be the source text for counseling, and really the only key source text for counseling, that the principle of counseling was to figure out where the sin is and to try to help people find ways to name the sin and to think differently in ways that sort of decrease sinful patterns and increase righteous patterns. And it tends to be very kind of authoritative. And that is something that most of my colleagues at Duke don't even know exists. But it's really important within especially the evangelical Christian world. And matter of fact, like near us, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which has several times the size of Duke Divinity School, as well as most of the Southern Baptist seminaries, that's their mode of teaching pastoral care and counseling. So if you think about how a lot of Southern Baptist pastors are taught, that's the kind of approach that they're taught. Not to say it's always that. I mean, people can be really skilled, once they get experience in pastoral care, and it doesn't always look exactly like what I just named, but that's the kind of history of that mode of biblical counseling. So I'm very sympathetic to those that are trained in the clinical mental health disciplines and might call themselves Christian psychologists or therapists. I know some really outstanding folks, but the fact that somebody names themselves that doesn't mean that they're good. I mean, you can have lousy Christian counselors, you can have lousy secular counselors. And I am a little bit more reluctant to encourage people to go to biblical counselors by that name because they tend to reject a lot of modern psychology, and I find that to be that's potentially harmful. So.
Yes, Lenny.
I just wanted to thank you for what you said about opening space for things not to be going well. Sometimes that's the kindest thing we can do for people.
Yeah.
And I have so many family members who will say to me, well, so-and-so died and I didn't know what to say to my friend. And it's just so hard for a lot of us when we don't know what to do. And I have found personally that sometimes the greatest way we show love is to open that space. And I thank you so much for saying that.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you couldn't hear, she was thanking Warren for kind of naming the importance of opening a space where things aren't going okay. That's fine. Something I always talk about because it just comes up all the time. A lot of times Christians feel some obligation to say something theological that will maybe fix the person involved, right? So they'll say, "Oh, it must be God's will," or "Oh, if it's not," whatever it is that we say.
Yeah, never respond when
Never.
somebody's talking about things going wrong with anything that begins with the words "at least."
Yeah.
Just don't do it.
Yeah. Not going anywhere good.
And never respond with anything that begins with "it must be" or "this must be," because how do you know? Just don't respond. It's better to be silent than to respond in either of those ways. Or God is testing you, or
Yeah, and as I like to say, don't say, "Oh, I know how you feel." You have no clue how the other person feels. Someone can say, "I had an abusive father," and if you had an abusive father, you can't say, "I know how you feel," because it was entirely different. And the way to find out how they feel is to say, "Tell me more about how you feel." That actually, as long as they may not want to, but that's okay too. They at least know that you care and that you are ready to listen. So expressions of love and openness and listening are always helpful within the life of the church, but giving a little theological witticism or some counsel or all these things, it's never do those things.
I think one of the biggest things that people fear in the context of especially depression, but also other forms of mental illness, is abandonment. So I think one of the key things is, like, even if it's hard and you don't know how to respond, just keep some form of contact with people and keep pressing on. When somebody's depressed, they may not be able to answer emails or even pick up the phone, something like that, but just keep on, and then eventually, usually that person will then be able to engage in a relationship again. But that continuity of relationship is really important.
I mean, there's a learning curve on that. I mean, I've talked to someone recently who felt abandoned by the church and said, people sent me emails for a while, but then they stopped. And what she was saying is that if you've not seen this, you have no idea what I'm talking about. I was so low, I couldn't get the energy to respond to an email. Now, if you're a happy, chipper person, that just seems unbelievable. It almost seems rude. But for somebody who's in that kind of darkness, it's not unbelievable and it's not rude. But again, the continuing expression of love. And the other thing to remember is that this is a long haul, right? We're accustomed to illnesses that you can go to the doctor and they treat you in a fairly short dispatch. You get better. They give you a medicine, maybe you have surgery, there's some time of recovery, and within a few weeks you're better. But with mental illness, it's a long road, and maybe there's some things you don't stop having it, you still have it. And can we live with that over the long haul as the church? Yes.
I'm not a member of your church, so I don't know how you all do everything. I think that for every person that is struggling with mental illness, there is a host of family and friends who struggle with them and need the support, and I feel like the church could do so much more with supporting the caregivers. I think we try, but again, if you don't get response after a period of time, you think, well, I must be bothering them, so I go away. Don't go away. You need to keep struggling with them. I have two things, and I know I'm supposed to be short.
She was just naming the importance of supporting caregivers.
Absolutely.
It's one thing to think about someone who battles a mental illness, but what about their spouse? What about their parent? What about their daughter? Anyway.
Right. There is a group in Charlotte called In Christ Supporting Ministries. I don't know if anybody's heard of it, but they do a once-a-month meeting for caregivers. And you can cry with them, you can laugh with them, but everybody in the room has something similar that they're going through, and it is absolutely, and it's from a Christian perspective, and it is absolutely wonderful. I would recommend it. There is also a book that's called Blessed Are the Crazy. Has anybody heard of this book? Breaking the Silence of Mental Illness in the Church. That I would recommend that book too.
Thanks.
I hope you all heard that. I can't recall. Sorry. Another question. Yes, in the back.
In general, diabetes is just a chemical imbalance in the head which causes mental illness, as I understand. Serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, these are different chemicals. If the balance is not right, then it causes different emotions. So is there a way to measure what the level of chemical that's there in our head, so that like when we're taking medication, we know what's the level of medication, which medication? Are there advances in these lines?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think your question is on the idea of chemical imbalance and can you actually know? And it's really interesting because we don't know that and we can't know that. And I sometimes use that image of imbalance of serotonin and norepinephrine or dopamine in talking about depression. But it's actually really interesting because there's actually no good way to measure any of that. It's really a manner of speaking. What we do know is that if somebody is depressed and they take a medication that increases, say, the availability of serotonin at certain places in the brain, then after about, not immediately, but after about 4 to 6 weeks, on average, they'll have a little bit less depression or a little bit less anxiety than they did before. And so what psychiatrists and also, I would say, drug companies have done to market these medications is they've said, well, depression is a matter of a chemical imbalance. But the problem is, like, it's a little bit misleading to speak that way because in any given person, we don't really know what a balance would look like. Like, I tell my residents at Duke, like, if a chemical balance came and sat in the room, how would you recognize it? Like, we don't know. We don't measure that. Like, there might be some very finely specialized research ways to measure certain receptor levels in the brain, but those are not in any way applicable in clinical use. So when we talk about chemical imbalance, we're basically talking on the level of metaphor. We're saying something's happening in your brain, and giving you a medication makes things a little bit different, and that seems to make a change. But it doesn't mean that the cause of everything is a chemical imbalance. We use the language of chemical imbalance, and what we really mean is, like, life feels out of balance, and taking this medication can help life feel a little bit more in balance, and we project that onto just the brain. But the idea of chemical imbalance is, at best, a partial truth. It actually doesn't. It doesn't hold up very well if you actually look at what is known in any given case of depression. So I'd prefer rather than saying depression is a chemical imbalance and therefore you need to take medication, I'd rather say depression happens when, for various reasons, life is not in balance, and there's the evident suffering that's associated with depression, and medication can be at best one block of a larger framework for addressing that. It can help provide a little bit of support, but isn't by any means usually enough itself.
Lauren.
Yes. Since most of us can't make it to Duke to get the degree that you have, do you have recommendations on resources, books, websites, apps, anything that we can use as a church body as we continue this journey of mental health in the church?
You mean, wait, you're a youth director and a mom, you don't have time to get a PhD at Duke? Like, what?
I would say all of you are welcome to Duke Divinity School, and so we actually, if any of you want to be on our Theology, Medicine, and Culture newsletter, I'll just plug that. I would love for you to be part of that and to know about our programs there. But with respect to websites, let me list a few, and I'm glad to provide this in form to James and the folks here so they can spread it. A few good resources. One is Pathways to Promise. It's pathways2promise.org. Another is the Interfaith Network on Mental Illness. That's inmi.us, inme.us. Another is a support ministry run by my friend Brandon Applehans, who lives with bipolar disorder in Denver, called My Quiet Cave. It's myquietcave.org. I'm going to forget a few. There's a pretty good ministry that's a little bit more evangelically oriented called Fresh Hope for Mental Illness, run by a Lutheran pastor in Nebraska named Brad Huffs, who is, and it's freshhope.us. There's also the NAMI FaithNet that has some good resources associated with it. A few good books that are, there's no perfect book out there, but a few books that are helpful, I think. One is Catherine Green McCrate's memoir called Darkness is My Only Companion. Another is a really interesting book. I don't follow this book theologically, but it's a really well-written memoir called Bipolar Faith by a Black womanist theologian named Monica Coleman, who writes of her own experience of depression and trauma. And it's a really interesting book about race and trauma and depression. It's incredibly well-written. My friend and colleague John Swinton has written a couple of books on mental illness. One is called, it's a book on dementia called Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. But it's a really excellent book that is applicable to lots of different forms of mental illness. And there's another book called forgetting the title of his first book, but it's a book on friendship and mental illness, and it'll come to me in a minute. But he's a good author who writes theologically about these questions in ways that I find helpful. Those are a few resources, yeah. And there's other good ones that are out there.
Marilyn?
All of those are available in our library, actually.
Thank you, Melanie. Yeah.
All of those available for you. You're welcome to go down to the library and check out all those books and resources.
Yeah.
Don't take them all tonight. One per, but yes,
Exactly,
we'll share.
yeah,
We'll
yeah.
share. Marilyn, you had your hand up.
Yes, I have a question. How do you know if a person is going through loss and sadness over time? When does it become depression? How do you
Yeah.
judge that? And, what are the signs?
Yeah.
What can you do?
Yeah. So the difference between loss and sadness and depression.
Initially says, I don't want to live. I'm very unhappy.
Yeah.
And then it goes to this deep sadness where functioning is difficult. And then it goes
Yeah.
into, just a turmoil of life. And I'm just curious, is there anything?
Yeah.
Sorry. She was asking about how, let's say you have loss and you're sad, you're deeply sad. When does that go into depression versus just, yeah.
Yeah. I think there's lots of debate about how to differentiate that. I think the most important question to me is what's needed right now for the journey. Because if you start with that question, then the argument about when loss and sadness end and depression begins becomes less important, because a lot of the things that you're going to do in each situation are the same, like support, making sure that safety is there, connection to relationship, ability to grieve. All those are really important. So in some sense, that's in some sense it doesn't matter in terms of how it's labeled. When psychiatrists debate this and we wonder where does bereavement or especially grief end and depression begin, people who research this will say that most people after, especially the loss through death of someone, so bereavement, which is a particular form of grief, but not the only one, will say that most people who are grieving will have times when, they might want to join another person in the afterlife, but it doesn't usually go to the active desire to kill oneself or hurt oneself. So it's not usually associated with active thoughts of suicide. And also, most people in the context of grief don't have lots of what we call distortions in thinking, where reality testing seems to be sort of impaired, where people will get paranoid or have thoughts of things that are true that aren't true. And most people don't absolutely lose the capacity to get out of bed and to eat and that kind of thing. Although everybody in the context of grief feels lower appetite, lower energy. So there's a lot of similar, but it's a matter of both degree and in some cases, like with suicidality, there's things that psychiatrists would say, oh wow, that sounds more than what most people experience in the context of grief. So we might need to treat that a little bit more aggressively, including with medication, for example. But I think the key question to start with is what's needed right now for the journey. And if you start with that question, it doesn't matter as much how you name it as what you need to do. And then it makes it a little more clear.
Okay, I'm going to call last question. I'm going to go to Ernest.
I'm a psychiatrist myself. But
Yes. Yes, good to see you.
I think it's very important in such cases where you say, when does sadness and depression start? Family history is very important.
That's right.
You have to take the family history up to 3 generations, including asking them what their suicides, attempted suicides, and if there are, then this person should be put on medicine very early. There is no question about that. And in any case, if the person is not functioning very well in 3 months, medication must be tried. And sometimes you have to try more than one medicine at the same time. The idea of multiple receptors needing multiple medicine. Once I attended a seminar at Harvard, your school. I'm from Yale. We have some things going together. And professor there, ultimately, a lot of questions were going on. What's the best treatment? And he said, the best treatment is what you provide. Second thing is, as we grow older, we need every 10 years one medicine added to us. And he said, I myself am 60 and I am on 6 medicines. And one of them is an antidepressant. And he was functioning very well. So we should not be afraid of combining all these things together.
So Ernest, some of you won't have heard that. Ernest is a psychiatrist himself, and would you kind of pick up on some of what he said and reiterate that? For
Yeah,
folks?
that's not my approach, but I think it speaks to the need to really think individually about what people need, and I certainly have people that are on multiple medications and doing really well. So yeah, I wouldn't say I wouldn't make that a matter of course, but I think it's something that in individual cases may be called for. So thank you.
I said last one, but I'll jump in.
Media tends to perpetuate negative stereotypes in regards to mental illness. How would you propose to counter that, or through the church?
Yeah.
He's asking how media perpetuates stereotypes. TV shows, everything. Yeah.
Are you thinking about a specific context of media? Yeah. Yeah. I think that yeah.
Generates a lot of fear in people that have different things and don't talk about it, especially if you go to church, you don't talk about it. Like I have bipolar.
Yeah.
I don't want to go to church and go, oh, I have bipolar,
Yeah.
And it's really hard when media. What do you think the church can do to combat some of those negative stereotypes possibly?
Well, first of all, just with the specific instance of the response to the school shooting, to make Parkland only a matter of mental illness is, I think, just evil, because it implies that mental illness was the central issue of what was happening, and I just don't think that that's the case, especially when it's used as a way not to talk about guns and not to talk about just youth culture as a whole, and not to talk about social disconnection and what's happening in cultures. So I think that is a way of basically getting everybody else off the hook, so that we can focus just on getting particular people into treatment, is, I think, a really negative media stereotype, as you described. I mean, I think in general, it's the role of the church is, I mean, I'm just so glad that you're here and that you're speaking up and you're saying, I have bipolar disorder and I'm here. And in the midst of that, and I think that the more there are people who are open about living with bipolar disorder and other forms of mental illness, that have leadership roles in churches, that are active in worship and in service, that are known, you don't have to hide it, you can just be who you are, and that becomes a part of the church's culture, as I think it can be, then I think then all of a sudden the power of that stigma is broken. To the extent that that's the case, and I'm just glad that you're here and voicing that. Yeah, I think people who are in major positions of media prominence and who come out as having live with mental illness, I think that's really helpful. When you have somebody come and say, I've lived with depression or I've lived with mental illness. But for the rest of us, I think just living where we are, being open about who we are, where we are, and to emphasize that like living with mental illness is just a way of being human, and it's a way of being human that almost half of us share or will share over the course of our lives. So to be able to name that is to say, the fact that any of us live with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or anything else, it's just that's one of the facts of our lives as we go about what it means to be human in relationship and church and everything else. So.
And to, I know it's harder, but to remember that any given person by chance that you happen to share something with, they may not be ready, but it doesn't mean that the entire church is not ready. I've had people, this happened a couple years ago. Somebody came and visited our church. I knew he was a visitor, and he came and sat down to, our grouchiest curmudgeon. I could just see them. And he talked to me later, and he said, that guy next to me didn't speak. I go, he didn't speak to me either. It's not. So some people aren't prepared to handle any kind of odd thing that you might share with them, right? And so, but someone will. So it's harder to ask that when it's a painful kind of thing to talk about, right? And on the shooting thing, I want to reiterate what Justin Perry said 2 weeks ago. This is really interesting. Justin wanted me to ask about shootings and mental illness, and what he said the same thing. It's really a horribly dangerous stereotype to connect those two. And then what he said is that what he would chalk a lot of it up to is this: we have this bloated expectation of what it means to be a male in our culture. That males have to be, they're tough, they're strong, they're in control, they wrench control from situations. That's just like what it means to be a guy. This was reiterated in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday. There was a long article on exactly the same thing. That was really interesting.
Yeah.
So that was good.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. No, please.
I was going to end with a really uplifting statistic that the highest, the demographic category that's the highest risk of suicide in the United States is white men older than age 85. You think, well, that's really interesting. Like, what would it be about not just being older, but being a white man older than 85 that puts somebody at really high risk of suicide, about 5 times the risk of the general population and twice the risk of black men older than 85? And I think, well, I don't know exactly why it is, but I do know that to be white in our culture is to be formed, especially to be a white man in our culture, maybe especially to be a white man who was raised in the 1930s, 40s, 50s in our culture, is to be taught, that you're to be in control, you're to be independent, you're to be the provider, you're not to depend on anybody, and you're not to show weakness. So then when you get to be 85, and all of a sudden you're having physical problems and starting to lose the capacity to do that, then what use does our culture have for you, if that's the expectation? And I think that's in part why white men older than 85 are at such high risk of suicide. So it speaks, again, to this question of, like, these are cultural formations. There's nothing genetic about being white that predisposes to suicide, but there's an awful lot culturally about being white that predisposes to suicide in that particular case. And so I think just being alert to those questions and to the way that we are just taught from such an early age, I speak as a white man, but maybe all of us to some extent are taught not to be dependent, not to be vulnerable, to be like those who are the givers and not the receivers. And that's just not what it means to be human.
This has been a really wonderful time together. I have a feeling that Warren will get invited back again for a third time. But Warren and I know this. We go places and we speak. At the end of the day, it's about you guys. Like, you've taken the time to come out tonight because you care about this. Every one of us in this room, you deal with something, or you love somebody, or you care about this, and that's why you got other stuff that you could be doing. You've come because of that, and we're grateful, and it's an honor to be in God's house to talk about these things together. It's the kind of thing that God's calling us to do. Don't forget what Bill asked about earlier. Go to our website and the things to sign up for that are coming up. They're really fascinating, will be really helpful, and we'll continue this conversation. So, Warren, thank you.
Thank you all for being here.